Welcome back to Nordic Arms and History. In the early 20th century, Norway didn't have one unified air force, but it had two, one under the army and one under the navy. At the time, aircraft weren't seen as independent tools of war, they were just support units, eyes in the sky for ground forces or the fleet. So, in 1912, the Norwegian Army Air Service, or Hærens Flyvåpen, and the Naval Air Service, or Marinens Flyvåpen, started developing separately. Each ran its own airfields, pilots, aircraft, and command structure. Together, they would eventually become the foundation of what we know today as the Royal Norwegian Air Force, or Luftforsvaret. Early on, the army side expanded much faster, and the navy grew much more slowly, but both built out full systems, and that meant two parallel air forces, each with its own logistics, aircraft types, and training programs. Coordination was not easy, and when the war came, that split would turn out to be the real problem. In this episode, we're taking a closer look at the origins of both branches, how they grew, where they struggled, and what finally pushed them to unite into one air force. Along the way, I've also been able to borrow some really cool artifacts from this period, and we'll be showing them along in the video as well. So, without further ado, let's begin. Established in 1912, the Army Air Service was based at Kjeller, just north of Oslo. This became its main airfield, flight school, and aircraft factory. Training began in 1914 with a class led by Captain Einar Sem Jacobsen, a pioneer who also helped set up the aircraft workshop. Roald Amundsen even trained there, reflecting early public excitement for flight. During World War I and into the 1920s, growth was limited by tiny budgets. A formal command was established in 1917 under Colonel Gustav Gruner, and his plans were drawn up for a national network of squadrons with around 90 aircraft. Only parts of this vision were realized. In 1927, Parliament approved a new structure, a central flying regiment in Kjeller, a Trøndelag Air Battalion, and a flying school. These were later reduced due to funding. Værnes became the new Trøndelag base in 1933, and Bardufoss Air Station opened in the north only in 1939. The Army Air Service supported ground forces with reconnaissance, artillery spotting, and air defense. By the late 1930s, it fielded dedicated fighters. Pre-war commanders included Colonel Thorvald Klingenberg and Colonel Ole Gulliksen. As of 1939, the force remained small, just 36 regular officers, 11 technical staff, and around 100 reserve pilots. Early aircraft were a mix of local and foreign models, including Maurice Farman biplanes, the Berlot 11, and the later Bristol F-2B fighters, and even DH-60 Moths. The Fokker C-5 became the workhorse in the 1930s, and by 1939, modern aircraft were arriving. Gloucester Gladiators, Curtiss Hawk 75s, and a few Caproni CA-310 light bombers. Unfortunately, many were not operational in time. Most Hawks were still in crates during the German invasion in April 1940. Key bases included Kjeller, Fornebu, Værnes, and Bardufoss. When the war broke out, only 7 Gladiators were able to scramble to meet the Luftwaffe, but were quickly outmatched. Aside from Sem Jacobsen, important figures included Major Bjarne Øen, who took command during the invasion and later became central to the exiled Norwegian air forces. General Otto Ruge, the army's commander-in-chief, had also pushed for unifying the air arms even before the war. The Naval Air Service also began in 1912, sparked by naval officers like Karsten Tank-Nielsen, who led a fundraiser to buy Norway's first military aircraft, a Rumpler Taube named Start. It was flown across the Oslofjord by Lieutenant Hans Fleischer Dons, making him the first Norwegian to pilot a military aircraft. Operations were based at Karl Johans Vern in Horten, where the Navy set up its own aircraft factory and flying school by 1915. Early leadership included Captain Haldan Gytt Dele. With a few resources, the Navy even borrowed Army airplanes for patrols during World War I. The first home-built seaplane came from the Horten workshop in 1915. In 1916, the Navy formally created Marinens Flyvåpen, led by Commander Jacob von der Lippe. It opened new seaplane bases in Kristiansand in 1918 and in Bergen in 1919. A 1927 reorganization aimed for 96 aircraft, but it was scaled back to 64 by 1933, and even that was optimistic. By 1937, only around 25 aircraft were operational. A base at Tromsø was finally opened in 1939. Personnel in 1939 included 49 officers, 18 mechanics, and about 90 reserve pilots. The Navy focused on maritime patrol, coastal defense, and naval strikes, relying on float planes and flying boats. Locally built models like the MF-1 to MF-11 series formed the core fleet. The MF-11, being introduced in 1932, became the mainstay, with 29 in service by 1940. Imported types included the Sopwith Baby, Hansa Brandenburg W-33, and a few Douglas DT-2 torpedo bombers. Just before World War II, the Navy acquired 6 advanced Heinkel HE-115 float planes. These had long range and were Norway's most capable combat aircraft, though only a few were operational at the time of the invasion. One captured Arado AR-196 was also flown in combat. The main bases included were Horten, Kristiansand, Bergen, and Tromsø, along with sheltered fjords used for dispersed operations. In addition to Dons and von der Lippe, key figures included Hjalmar Riiser-Larsen, a polar explorer and post-war Air Force founder, Finn Lützow Holm, a decorated pilot and pre-war commander. Lieutenant Thomas Juel Thommessen and Captain Henry Even Brun were also notable for early and daring naval flights. Many officers were accustomed to operating with limited resources in rugged environments, skills that would prove crucial during the war. By the late 1930s, Norway's split air services faced inherent problems due to their separation. The most obvious issues were duplication and inefficiency. Each service had its own chain of command, its own training programs, its own procurement and maintenance systems, and even its own aircraft factories, with Scheller being for the Army and Horten for the Navy. This dual structure meant that parallel efforts were often overlapped. Despite both branches ultimately pursuing the same broad goal of national air defense, for example, both the Army and Navy ran pilot schools with somewhat different curricula, and both designed or licensed aircraft, sometimes for similar roles, separately. Interwar studies consistently noted the obvious advantages of a merger: shared factories, unified workshops and logistics, common aircraft types, and a single training pipeline. A single unified air service could pool the meager budgets to prioritize the most urgent needs, whether it's fighters or patrol planes, and eliminate rivalry in acquisitions. Indeed, due to divided resources, neither service was adequately equipped by 1940. Plans for 90-plus aircraft in each branch was never materialized, and by 1939, the Army had only a few dozen mostly outdated planes, and the Navy had about 25 serviceable aircraft. In essence, splitting the air budget hampered both services from modernizing. Operationally, the separation also caused coordination problems. There was no central air command to develop a unified air strategy for Norway. During the German invasion in April 1940, this meant Army and Navy aircraft were deployed piecemeal under separate commands rather than a coordinated force. For instance, Army fighters engaged Luftwaffe bombers over Oslo, while naval seaplanes operated independently on coastal reconnaissance and bombing missions, all with no common headquarters. Communication and mutual support were limited, simply because the two air arms hadn't regularly trained or planned together pre-war. The Navy's insistence that maritime aviation was a unique specialization contributed to this mentality. Navy leadership felt that only they understood naval air operations properly, resisting any attempt to hand those assets to an independent authority. As one analysis puts it, the naval air arm was considered so special and central to the Navy that the Navy could not give it up, and similarly, the Army was reluctant to lose its air component. This resulted in a degree of inter-service rivalry, with each defending its turf. Even before World War II, forward-thinking officers saw the disadvantages. The question of merging the two air forces had been raised as early as in 1913 in Parliament, and revisited several times during the 1920s and 30s. The most significant review came in 1939, a Luftforsvarsutredning or air defense study led by Colonel Otto Ruge unequivocally recommended unifying the air arms. Notably, both the Navy's top admiral and the Army's commanding general initially supported examining a merger, recognizing the potential benefits. However, when the proposal neared political decision, the Navy reversed its stance. The admiral withdrew support, likely fearing the loss of Navy's independent air capability. Moreover, with war clouds looming in Europe in 1939, many argued that it was too risky to undertake a major reorganization of the military at that moment. Thus, the merger plan stalled on the eve of World War II, and the outcome was that Norway entered the war with a fragmented air command structure that hindered swift, unified action. The outbreak of World War II, and especially the Norwegian campaign of 1940, dramatically demonstrated the need for a unified air force. Norway was invaded on April 9, 1940. Both the Army and Navy air services fought bravely but were overwhelmed and largely obliterated within weeks. Surviving aircraft were destroyed, captured, or flown to exile. A number of Norwegian air personnel managed to escape Britain in May-June of 1940, among them key figures from both services. In the UK, these remnants had to regroup and continue the fight alongside the Allies. It became quickly apparent that maintaining two separate Norwegian air organizations was impractical in exile. Resources were few, and the British Royal Air Force was hesitant to coordinate with the two different Norwegian commands for essentially the same task. Captain Bjarne Øen of the Army Air Service emerged as a central organizer for the Army side, while Hjalmar Riiser-Larsen, recently brought back to head the Naval Air Service, led the Navy contingent. Both were determined that Norwegian airmen could continue the fight as distinct Norwegian units rather than being dispersed individually into the RAF. General Ruge had explicitly tasked Øen before departure to ensure Norwegian forces abroad fly under Norwegian colors to show that Norway was still in the fight. These officers collaborated to set up a joint training camp for Norwegian air personnel in Canada, famously known as Little Norway. In mid-1940, Øen proposed, and the government in exile approved, establishing a combined training center for both Army and Navy air crews in Toronto. By 1940, Little Norway had officially opened, a truly joint venture staffed by both services, officers, and recruits, training together for the first time. This cooperative effort nurtured a sense of unity among the new generation of Norwegian pilots. Meanwhile, in the UK, Norwegian squadrons were forming within the RAF. Number 330, the Norwegian squadron, stood up in April 1941, with naval personnel flying maritime patrols, initially with Catalina flying boats and Northrop seaplanes, followed by 331 and 332 squadrons. Norwegian fighter units formed in 1941 to 42, manned mostly by Army Air Service pilots. Initially, however, coordinating these developments was awkward. There was no single Norwegian air commander. The RAF grew frustrated dealing with two separate Norwegian staffs, one Army and one Navy, when arranging new squadrons. There were even instances of inter-service rivalry reappearing, as each branch vied to prioritize its own type of unit. For example, whether to form more fighter squadrons or more coastal patrol units. To address this, the Norwegian government in exile took a step towards unification by creating the Flyvåpenes Felleskommando, or the FFK, in March 1941. This joint air command placed both the Army and Navy air forces under a single combined command structure, formally separate from either the Army or Navy hierarchy. The esteemed naval aviator Hjalmar Riiser-Larsen was appointed chief of the FFK, with Army Captain, now Lieutenant Colonel Bjarne Øen, as his chief in staff. In practice, FFK served as an umbrella headquarters to streamline administration, training, and planning of the Norwegian air units in exile. Operational control of the squadrons was still exercised by the British, for example RAF Fighter Command or Coastal Command, but FFK represented Norwegian interests and managed Norwegian personnel and policy. This halfway solution improved matters. It presented one Norwegian point of contact to the British, and it fostered greater unity between the Army and Navy flyers, at least on paper. However, it was understood by many that FFK was only a temporary fix, essentially a trial merger. Indeed, several officers, especially the Army Air side, felt that full unification was still the ultimate goal, and that FFK was an inadequate compromise. Officers like Øen and Major Ole Reistad, Commandant of Little Norway, were strong proponents of creating a single independent air force as soon as possible. Reistad wrote in late 1941 urging a common air service as soon as possible. Øen likewise drafted a memo, likely in 1943, concluding that merging the air arms would clear away the whole host of unclear conditions that now exist, greatly increase efficiency, create clear lines of work, and, not least, enable a much more rational use of personnel that we have. Wartime Experience had highlighted specific problems from the split that even FFK couldn't entirely eliminate. For example, in 1943, an incident exposed continuing friction. The Naval Air Arm, under riiser-larsen's guidance, formed a new Mosquito fighter bomber wing within 333 Squadron to strike targets along Norway's coast. This was done rather hastily by naval officers, notably Major Finn Lambrechts, and led to accidents and disciplinary issues, prompting a temporary grounding of the Mosquito wing. More importantly, Norway's defense minister Oskar Torp was angered that this significant move, creating a new strike squadron, had been undertaken without close consultation with the government. To Torp, it looked like the air officers, especially the Navy side, were acting too independently. Egenrådige marineflyvere, as he termed it. The Army side wasn't happy either. The Army air officers complained that the Navy's focus on 333 Squadron's maritime role was jeopardizing their own plans to form a third fighter squadron for the liberation of Norway. Some Army officers felt that FFK HQ itself was dominated by naval flyers and not impartial. This discord in 1943 convinced Torp that political authority over the air forces needed strengthening, and he received the question of an outright merger. In April 1943, Torp ordered a new study into unifying the air services, aiming to bring them under firmer control and a single leadership, in part to prevent further unilateral actions by one branch. Although riiser-larsen initially argued against an immediate merger, likely fearing that it would disrupt ongoing operations in the middle of the war, by 1944 the momentum for unification had become unstoppable. The Supreme Allied Command and Norwegian High Command were planning the eventual liberation of Norway and post-war defense. In that context, the Norwegian High Command, Forsvarets Overkommando, started openly evaluating whether the old two-branch model would continue to work after the war. The consensus, outside of die-hard naval circles, was that a single air force would be far more efficient for a modern military. Defense Minister Torp strongly favored this, seeing it as an opportunity to prioritize across the two air services, and to rein in what he viewed as excessive branch autonomy. Despite stiff resistance from elements of the Naval Air Service and Naval High Command until the very end, they lobbied fiercely against losing their air arm. The Norwegian cabinet under Prime Minister Nygaardsvold decided to merge the two air services. Torp was the key driver. He wanted not only better wartime coordination, but to also lay the foundation of Norway's post-war defense on sound footing. The government explicitly framed this decision as part of raising the new defense for Norway in the future. On the 10th of November 1944, a royal decree was issued that formally merged Army and Navy air services into a single independent branch of the armed forces to be called the Royal Norwegian Air Force, or Luftforsvaret. This date is recognized as the Air Force Foundation Day. Notably, it was exactly 4 years to the day after the Norway's inauguration, a symbolic nod to the unity that achieved in exile. With this act, the Air Force became Norway's third service, equal in status to the Army and Navy. Also folded into the new Air Force was the Army's Anti-Aircraft Artillery Corps, or Luftvernartilleriet, consolidating all air and air defense units under one umbrella. General Major Hjalmar riiser-larsen was appointed First Chief of the Air Force, in recognition of his leadership to ensure continuity. However, the announcement was low-key, no big parades in wartime. Riiser-larsen simply issued a daily order taking command of Luftforsvaret. In the field, Norwegian squadrons continued operating under RAF command as before, so they noticed little immediate change operationally. The real impact was administrative and structural. From that point on, all Norwegian air units and personnel answered to one command. This eliminated the dual reporting and rivalry that had plagued the past. The rationale behind the merger was clear and had been forged by hard experience. Unifying the air services promised greater efficiency, clarity in command, and operational use of resources, as Øen and others had argued. Defense Minister Torp's motives was also to assert political control and strategic direction over air power under one air force. It would be easier to set coherent priorities, for example, how many fighters versus maritime patrol planes to procure, without inter-service politics. It also solved the problem of two independent sub-organizations. Torp believed that some naval aviators had taken too great liberties under the old setup. Now, a single Air Force commander would be held accountable. Furthermore, looking to the post-war era, a unified Air Force was seen as essential for a small country like Norway to modernize and integrate new technologies like radar, jet aircraft, etc. efficiently. In short, wartime lessons from the 1940 defeat to the coordination achieved in exile proved that the split system was obsolete. The merger was much about preparing for the future as winning the war in its final months. Transitioning to one Air Force was not without its growing pains. A few senior Navy officers were unhappy with the change. In fact, 4 naval air officers, including Commander Finn Lutzow-Holm, the Naval Air Service Chief, chose to remain in the Navy rather than transfer to the new Air Force branch. There was also a debate about uniforms and ranks. Ultimately, the Air Force adopted a uniform similar to the RAF's blue, but as a concession, former naval aviation officers were allowed to continue wearing their Navy uniforms for a time if they wished. Such issues illustrate the cultural adjustment required to fuse two organizations with long separate traditions. Nonetheless, the unification proceeded smoothly overall. By the end of World War II, May 1945, Norway had an integrated air force structure coordinating its fighter squadrons and maritime squadrons alike. The advantages of the new structure became evident in the post-war years. A single command could develop Norway's air defense without the internal divisions of the past. The problems of split authority and duplication were resolved. The Royal Norwegian Air Force would go on to build upon the combined legacy of Hærens and Marinens Flyvåpen, with the wartime merger of 1944 as the pivotal turning point that made this possible. Alright everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. Keep in mind that I will be making more deep dives into each branch in its own video, so we'll be going a lot more deeper into the nitty-gritty of the history on these two branches, which is something I will be doing. Also, as usual, if you have any questions regarding the video or have just any history or stories you want to share, feel free to comment them down below. And as usual, if you want to learn more about Nordic arms and history, consider subscribing. Until the next one, take care. Bye-bye.